After the Mexican War, California applied for admission to the Union as a free state. Since there were 15 northern states and 15 southern states at the time, this created quite a political conflict. In 1850, Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky offered his colleagues in Congress a compromise. The Compromise of 1850 allowed for California to become a free state, while the other territories in the Southwest would have the right to decide for themselves by popular vote to become free or slave states. The Compromise of 1850 had preserved the Union, just as the Missouri Compromise had in 1821. The divisive forces in the nation, however, were already too far advanced to warrant such optimism. In 1854, a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas introduced a bill to Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This bill allowed the Kansas and Nebraska territories to enter the Union and again let the people decide if they were to be free states or slave states. Abolitionists from the North rushed to the territories and clashed with slave-owning settlers from the South. More than 200 people were killed in what was to be known as Bleeding Kansas. On October 16, 1859, a Kansas settler named John Brown gathered a group about him and raided Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the intent of providing Negroes with guns with which to begin an insurrection. Though he was hanged by the federal government for treason, he became a symbol to the Southerners of the true intentions of the North and a symbol to some Northerners of the need for exactly the type of action the South so feared. The year before, a heated Senate race was waged in Illinois. Incumbent Stephen Douglas, a Democrat, was being challenged by a lawyer from the town of Springfield named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was running as a candidate of the newly formed Republican Party. At the Illinois State Convention, he warned his party that a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Douglas and Lincoln debated 7 times in 7 different Illinois counties, but in the end, Lincoln lost the election to Douglas. The heated debates, however, made Lincoln famous throughout the country. So famous that in 1860, the Republican Party nominated Lincoln for President of the United States. The Democrats, unable to decide on one candidate, split into 3 separate factions, and 3 separate candidates were nominated, one of them being Lincoln's old adversary, Stephen Douglas. Receiving just 40% of the popular vote, but winning a majority of the electoral votes, Abraham Lincoln became our nation's 16th president. Many Southerners feared that Lincoln and his fellow Republicans would abolish slavery, and this they would not tolerate. Their only recourse, they decided, was to leave the Union. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. By February 1861, other Southern states followed suit and formed the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as their president. When Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, he and the federal government refused to meet with members of the new Confederate government. He believed that no state had the legal right to secede from the Union. In fact, the very act of secession was considered an act of rebellion against the United States. Confederate officials demanded that the federal government abandon their military forts and arsenals that were in Confederate territory. Again, Lincoln refused. Southern militia units began to seize these federal forts and arsenals and met with little resistance. Then the Southern troops came upon Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The federal troops stationed there refused to yield. On April 12th, Confederate troops opened fire on the fort. 2 days later, the federal troops had no choice but to finally surrender. Lincoln, upon hearing the news, called for 75,000 volunteers to quell the Southern uprising.